just because you've got psoriasis or eczema or, dyshydrotic, all the skin conditions you can potentially have. Just because you have that and that's not responding right away does not mean there aren't other things that your diet can help.
That's pretty good. All right. So I first saw Dr. Shawn Baker on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I think that was in 2017, I believe. And that time I was vegan. And of course I was watching the podcast and I was like, seriously, who is this giant Viking looking doctor who's telling the world that meat is the key to overall health, awesome athleticism. And I was like, this is the biggest load of crap I've ever heard in my life. I was mad. I was frustrated. I was like, who is this dude? Well, the truth always comes out. And obviously you guys know I'm a carnivore diet eater now, but that leads me to my very, very first question. What led you to starting this diet in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, it was purely an interest in health. I mean, I tried a whole bunch of diets. I mean, I can honestly say I never did a vegan diet because it didn't appeal to me. I mean, I knew I wouldn't like the food. I mean, I came close. I mean, I had a mostly vegetarian diet initially for about 3, 4, 5, 6 months, and I just didn't like it very much. And so, really, it was just a continued personal journey to try to see what helped me out the most. And I mean, that's what I found. And when I went on the Rogan show, it was on Pearl Harbor Day back on December 7th, 2017. And, I'd been doing it, right at about a year at that point. And so some people had already kind of been aware of what I've been doing. But I mean, obviously that was a fairly, a moment where a lot of people got exposed to this. And yeah, I mean, in retrospect, I mean, looking at the video, it seems like you're a crazy person when you're up there. But at the same time, I knew what I was saying was what I experienced and what I felt was the truth. And I wasn't trying to be disingenuous or try to mislead anybody. And, like I said, it's at the end of the day, you got to do what works for you. And obviously some people, and maybe not all people, but many people are finding a meat-based diet, is very effective. And I think that's, to me, I think as a physician, I think that's just tremendous that we have another tool in our tool chest that we can use. And, there are, as there are a lot of, almost religious-like ideology that goes around what we eat. And I think, if we're really dispassionate about it and scientific and objective about it, we should just say, okay, what are the foods that make us feel better? What foods work for us, and what few foods, tend to cause diseases to go away. And I think there's some, even with a vegan diet, I mean, obviously you went vegan for, I don't know why you did that. I mean, I assume maybe thought for health reasons. And I don't doubt that some people get healthier for certain issues on a vegan diet just by giving up garbage food that we eat. And there's some benefits there. But I mean, again, which one's most best for everybody long-term, I think it's hard to say. I think, I think we should have the right to make that decision, which is one of the things that I've been frustrated with. People saying that, you should not be allowed to eat a certain way because we think this or that, which I think is based on problematic data. But anyway, let's go.
That's great. So one of your advice, that's what I love, is you've told people time and time again, this is what I do and it's working great for me now. If I need to change in the future, I'll do so. And I hear you say that to other people all the time. I'm curious, as far as people who might have inspired you, or the research that you did that led you to being like, on a scientific level or even like an experiential level, like, okay, the adjustment is all meat. How did that kind of come about?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that any rigorous science is, I mean, just because having studied this stuff for many years now, I mean, we just don't know. I mean, the bottom line is all of our nutritional efforts, nutritional science efforts to tell us what the correct diet to eat is really just based on a really poor approximation of science. I mean, we just don't have there's no study that I can point to that tells you or I what we should eat as human beings. It's just impossible to do those studies. And therefore, if you accept that fact, then you have to say, I'm going to use a different paradigm to solve my problem. So I wasn't really looking for a particular study that says, this is what I'm supposed to eat. I looked at human experience. I looked back, into, what people ate years ago, what was plausible, what people ate many years ago. I saw examples of people thriving on all meat diets. I looked at, I'm a strength athlete most of my life. I'm competing in kind of more aerobic based sport now, but I looked at athletes from back in the days, the pre-steroid eras where they had good physiques, and you saw guys like Vince Caranda and some
Right.
of these other, classic bodybuilders, and they were eating, either purely meat-based diets or heavily meat-based diets. So I thought, well, that seems to work for those guys. What's wrong with just trying it? And so that's what kind of inspired me. And I did it for, when I first started, I would do it for, a few, 3 or 4 days here and there, maybe a week here and there. Maybe I went up to 2 weeks, and then finally got up to a period where I did it for a month, and I didn't die, nothing bad happened to me, and then went back to eating what I was eating before and just didn't feel as good. And so I was like, well, I'd rather, all things being equal, and uh, the only difference was I was eating a few more fruits and vegetables, and I was like, all things being considered, I'd rather feel good than not. And so that's what kind of made me make the decision I did.
Cool. What's a typical day of eating look like for you? Are you still doing some intermittent fasting? Are you let my listeners and my viewers know? That's what they love to know. Like, what the hell do you eat? How do you season your food? How do you cook it? The details.
Yeah, my if I were to say my average day, and not every day is an average day, but my average day would be 2 meals. Usually, I'll eat a fairly, relatively early breakfast, if I can, and then I'm gonna have usually a fairly early dinner. I'm probably done eating by about 6 p.m. For me, like I said, I'm 6'5", I'm 250 pounds, I'm fairly muscular. I'm eating about 4 pounds of meat a day. I mean, that's what kind of it takes to fuel my machine. Now, I've gone, if I want to get really lean, I'll drop that down. If I want to put on some muscle, I'll eat a little bit more. I mean, it's pretty simple. Um, Most of the time, I just put salt. Sometimes I'll throw some seasoning on there if I'm feeling like something a little different. But if I'm cooking for other people that like more seasoning, it doesn't bother me too much to do that. There are other people out there where, they got to be pretty strict, and particularly if you're dealing with autoimmune diseases, or we can get into skin diseases where they find that sometimes particular seasonings and spices do cause problems. For me, it's generally not. If I eat something that's really heavily seasoned, I mean, I might get a little upset stomach or have a little bowel issue, but generally it's not a major problem. I mean, I'll eat some dairy from time to time. If I eat too much of it, I don't feel as good. I'll put on a little body fat, so I try not to eat too much dairy. I'll eat some eggs from time to time. I'll eat some seafood. I'll get some vegetable matter if I'm in a restaurant and they've got some seasoning on there. I'm not like screaming at the chef that don't dare put a vegetable near me. I'm not at that point where I don't need to for my own health, and I'm not in a religious, it's not a dogma for me. It's just I'm trying to do the best thing I can most of the days. And I honestly, and like I said, on my son's 6th birthday back in November, I had a big old piece of chocolate cake. And I didn't die. I honestly didn't feel all that good. It felt kind of bad in my stomach, but I enjoyed it. It tasted good. And, like I said, from time to time, I would imagine, I'm 52. Hopefully I've got a few more years left. Hopefully a lot more years. Hopefully, there's probably some people that are wishing that I heal over time, but assuming I don't do that, I'm sure I'm going to have a piece of dessert here and there, and a piece of fruit here and there down the road. I don't imagine I won't do that. But at the end of the day, I'm going to assess what it does to me, and how I feel. So I recently won the indoor rowing world championships, and I was very pointed about I'm going to spend the 2 months prior to this eating nothing but red meat. I ate not a thing outside of that. I didn't eat an egg. I didn't eat a lick of dairy.
Mm-hmm.
Pure red meat. Just to prove that I could do it. And I was fortunate to win the world championships.
Congrats!
And so it's just like,
congratulations.
thank you. And so that's kind of what most of my days look like. And again, my day is my day, and your day can be something different. I find that, when we talk about intermittent fasting, I do honestly believe humans are not designed to be eating constantly. I think that's a huge problem. And I think with, a meat-based diet, it's very easy to eat infrequently. And I don't sit there with a stopwatch saying, oh my gosh, I can't eat for another 17 minutes because I'm outside my eating window doesn't start till then. I just eat when I'm hungry. And, if I can, sometimes I'm kind of hungry and there's no food around. I'm in the car and I'm driving. I'm not going to be home for an hour. So it's like, hey, I eat when I can. There's some point where I think some people really need to be disciplined about it. And some people, if they're really metabolically broken and they're morbidly obese and they really have a struggle with appetite regulation, I think sometimes putting those eating windows on those people can be helpful I think for most human beings and most animals, you should have a diet that allows you to kind of eat when you're hungry and not eat when you're not hungry. And, you should have a relatively healthy body composition from doing that. And that's kind of what I do. I don't worry about it. I don't, my diet is stress free, man. I just eat. I'm like, I get up in the morning, I'm like, man, what do I want? How hungry am I? And I'll figure it out. Do I want one steak or two? And that's about as complicated as it gets for me most times.
Awesome. So when you were focusing on this last world record, how did you change your diet in any way, specifically in terms of like adding more fatty cuts to get more calories, or were you getting more lean for it? Because a lot of my subs are people who have cleansed the hell out of themselves, and they're either hard gainers or they're malnourished, and they want to stay healthy, but they want to put on a little healthy weight. That's kind of the question, plus the athletic side of it, kind of a double question there.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I'll just come at it in general terms. I think in general, most people, whether frail and thin or even, obese, morbidly obese, or malnourished, I think it's a problem. It's with the obese people, it's not a calorie malnourish issue. It's just an actual nutrition issue. It's not getting enough, whatever is, protein or essential fatty acids or minerals, things we have to survive as humans. I think there's a lot of people that are in that situation. And I think in those people, and in most people in general, particularly as they approach a more nutritious diet, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a carnivore diet, but I'll use a carnivore diet for an example. I think you just need to eat enough, and you need to eat when you're hungry for a period of time and not really worry about the weight gain or the weight loss necessarily. So I think it's the first goal is let's bring our level of nourishment back up to what is normal for humans. And, when we look at old people, people that as they age, the first thing not the first thing we see, but we often see, a lot of our tissues start to wither away. I mean, we call it sarcopenia, in some, if it's fairly severe, but I mean, we do see consistently that our internal organs start to shrink. If we look at older people, we do a CT scan of their head, their brain will start to shrink, their skin will get thin, all those things start to shrink because it's hard for you to absorb nutrition. Our one of the things we think is that we lose some of our capacity for digestion as we get older, and we consider that a normal consequence of aging, when really it's probably not. It's really just disease, manifesting itself in the GI tract. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword. You get sick from eating garbage food, then you lose the capacity to absorb nutrition, and then you get sicker and sicker. And then what happens is your body starts to draw on its own resources, and then we start seeing, loss of kidney function as the kidneys get to shrivel up, and we see, loss of mental function as our brain shrivels up. Again, this is advanced. And so I think in the beginning, you got to eat. You just got to fill it up. You got to eat. Hopefully you can fix some of those gastrointestinal issues so that you absorb nutrition better. And then when you get that full, nourishment complement back up and you're feeling good, and then you can start to say, okay, now what do I want to do athletic wise? What do I want to do body composition wise? And then and then I think if you're a well-nourished, physiologically normally functioning human, then a lot of the rules we see about calories start to come into effect. So as I said, if I want to get leaner personally, I know what I need to do personally. I'm going to eat a little bit leaner meat, and I'm gonna knock my calories down a little bit. Now, when I was training for competing, I want to eat more because I'm putting out the horsepower, and I don't care if I've got a six pack. I'm just caring about how hard I can pull in a damn rowing machine. And so,
right.
So for that strategy, I was eating 4 or 5, sometimes 6 pounds a day because I was training pretty damn hard. So I think there's different ways to look, and you're absolutely right. Fat is, when we talk about, if we want to put on lean muscle mass. So, the way to do that is you have to get in a requisite amount of protein, and that's, we can debate about what the exact number is. Some people say 1.6 grams per kilogram up to maybe as high as 2.6. So you got to get your minimum amount of protein in there to build your muscle. Some of it has to be leucine. There's a certain amount of leucine that has to be in there. And that's one of the reasons why animal source protein tends to be better than plant source protein, because it's easier to get leucine and some of these other, really truly indispensable amino acids like lysine. And the ratios are important. It's not just crude nitrogen or blank amino acids. And that's where people can say, well, I get X amount of protein from broccoli. Yeah, but it doesn't have as much lysine. It doesn't have much leucine. And so each of these particular individual amino acids has a role, and particularly with muscle building, leucine seems to be one of the big ones. And so beyond that, then it becomes calories. If you want to put on muscle, you've got to have enough of a caloric surplus. And so then how do you get your calories? Well, it can come from fat. Or it can come from eating more protein. So you could eat, a lot more protein, and fat's probably a better way to get calories in, just because it's, you know, you don't have to eat as much, and it's not as physically challenging to eat. You know, to eat like 5 pounds of lean chicken breast is really, really difficult. To eat
Right.
that much, you know, where there's a little more fat on it, is probably easier. Now, some people argue that because they'll say fat is very satiating. I see that point to some degree, but at the same time, it's very easy. And this is one of the problems we see in the ketogenic community, is a lot of people find it very easy to eat fat. They'll make fat bombs. They'll mix up, you know, some heavy cream and some stevia and a little flavoring and drink that down. And then that's knock back 1,000 calories in no time. And so it depends on your fat source to some degree. I mean, animal fat tends to be difficult for some. I mean, meat fat tends to be difficult for some people. And so it's, you know, it's really kind of context. And I tell people, I can't tell you for sure. I can tell you what in general works for many people, but you really do have to kind of experiment a little bit yourself and see what works. Because there are people that, you know, they'll find that increasing the fat content in their diet helps them to lean out a little bit, probably because maybe it's causing them to not eat as much. Because, you know, like I said, I know personally, it's kind of weird. I can eat, you know, 3 or 4 pounds of ribeye in one sitting, which is a lot of meat.
Mm-hmm.
I struggle to do that with brisket, which is even fattier, I think. And so I just find that, you know, it's funny how the way that works. But you get a feedback. You kind of get a feedback
I'm
on this.
finding that same thing where there are certain cuts of meat and certain ways that I, excuse me, either grill them or bake them or prepare them, where I can 3 pounds in a meat in a sitting is like boom. Where other times, if it's a little leaner or a little fattier, or I cook it different, a little more raw, a little overcooked, it's like a pound of meat I can barely get down. And generally, what I do in those circumstances, because I fall closer to the hard gainer than the easy put on weight guy. I've been just doing a little bit of concentrated fats after my meat meals, and that seems to make it, you know, super easy. Either a little MCT oil or tallow or duck fat or something right afterwards, just a spoonful. And I find that helps digestion, and it really fills me out without gaining much extra fat. And I some clients of mine are having that same type of situation as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, it just comes back to, you know, adequate protein, adequate calories, and then of course, you got to do the training. Obviously, if you're going to work out, you know, you got to put in the time in the gym. It's not a magic. You know, I mean, you know, there are people that are untrained that don't really do much, that go on a protein heavy or meat heavy diet, and they do put on a little muscle. But I mean, to really, you know, put on real muscle, like you and I are talking about in the gym, you got to get in the gym and do it, or you got to do
Right.
something. You got to do some kind of resistance training.
Totally. I'm really curious what your training routine, your weekly training routine, it's got to be crazy. What's that look like these days?
Well, I mean, you know, it's kind of funny. I'm doing this 300 push-ups a day thing right now just for fun. I'm doing 30 days of that. So, I mean, I pop out of bed, knock out 75 push-ups. I'm doing sets of 75. And then, you know, a couple times there, it's noon here. So I've done my 4 sets. So I've got my 300 done for the day. I'll do, you know, I'm probably going to go to the gym and deadlift today. In addition to that, right now, and it varies, you know, by season, by time, you know, what I'm doing specifically training wise. When I'm training to compete in rowing or break a record on the rowing machine, it's going to be a lot more rowing, obviously. You know, so my general philosophy, and I made this thing called carnivore training system, which is basically a workout based program with diet thrown in there. You know, I'm in my 50s, and so I think there's some important things you need to focus on. And so one is strength. I think you need to have strength, and so you need to do, you know, some part of your week has to be dedicated to developing strength. And that's deadlift, squats, pressing. You know, the basic heavy stuff. And then I think you also need to have a component of conditioning, right? I mean, we know we want to be able to move and have cardiorespiratory fitness. I do a lot of, you know, hit style stuff, a lot of high intensity, you know, real high intensity, sprint as hard as I can on the rower, sprint as hard as I can on the bike, get on the treadmill and run sprints, or go outside and run hill sprints or something like that. Decent recovery period so I can maintain that intensity. I'm very big on something that a lot of people don't do a much of, but on maintaining explosivity. And so a lot of people will do that. You know, you can use the Olympic lifts. The problem with the Olympic lifts is they're very technical. It's very easy to not do them correctly. There's injury potential. And so I might do high pulls where instead of doing a full clean, I'll just do the high pull. But I do a lot of work with medicine balls and jumping, because I think that is, one, it's technically pretty easy to do. It doesn't require a lot of skill to learn how to jump or to throw a medicine ball, and you're not going to get hurt. And so I do I might take a 20 pound medicine ball and just throw it up in the air as high as I possibly can, you know, set to 3, you know, just low reps recovery period. I want to be explosive, focusing on moving quickly. And so that, and then I do a little bit of hypertrophy work, a little bodybuilding stuff, because I think you need to maintain the muscle mass. And that's kind of where how my weeks generally rotate through, and I try to get a little bit of that in each week. If I'm like, I hadn't done this in a while, I need to focus on that. And so again, my goal is not bodybuilding. My goal is not to, deadlift a heavy single anymore. My goal is, sometimes it's on a rowing machine, but in general, just for general day-to-day stuff, I want to hit all those components. And so I continue to do those things.
Awesome. I think that's a great standpoint. It's the basics, right? It's eat healthy, what works for you, eat enough, get your calories, move your body in functional ways, pick up heavy stuff, cross different planes. And I like what you throw in there with some sort of focus on getting your cardiovascular through explosive training. I think that's something that people should open their eyes to a lot more. Sport and athletic training and explosiveness, it's fun. Going out and running for 2 hours, there's people that just love that. But for me, I would rather learn a skill or play a game or do something that's explosive. I'm an ex-athlete as well. Makes the workouts go by fast. You can enjoy other people while you do it. The long breaks make for conversation and meditation. Awesome stuff. I'm curious to switch topics a little bit, focusing kind of bit on the gut health, the colon health. What you hear, here's what I got from my mom and from the vegan community when I switched over. Oh, well, you're going to get colon cancer, and all that cholesterol is going to give you heart disease. What do you have to say about that, Dr. Shawn Baker?
Yeah, so let me address the colon cancer issue first, because so what we have is, as you probably may be aware, and many vegans point this out to me all the time, the World Health Organization in 2015 came up with a position, statement that's saying that red meat, processed meat was a class 1 carcinogen, regular red meat was a class 2, which means probable but not for sure. And they base that largely on epidemiologic studies, and they flat out say that. They say we have several epidemiologic studies which point to a small but consistent risk for colorectal cancer, in the populations we study. And then they point to a couple mechanistic studies which kind of say why this may be plausible, whether it's heme iron, whether it's polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, whether it's heterocyclic amines, whether it's some of these other compounds, the unique meat sugars, TMAO or something like that. But none of those things ever actually showed cancer in humans. They just never, you got some rat studies that are kind of show that. Most of the rat studies, by the way, most of the mice studies don't show that. So when you feed these animals meat-based diets or heavier meat, and they never get a fully meat-based diet, they get a little bit of meat plus vegetable oil and some sugar in their bread to get cancer, and they're given pro-cancer medications to try to speed up the process, but they don't actually even develop cancer in most cases. They might show some early changes in their colon which may later go on to cancer. Like there's something called a colonic crypt, and we see that actually there's studies out there that show it in a high fiber diets also induce these colonic crypts, but we don't hear about that because the epidemiology doesn't match that. So there's mechanisms for anything to show cancer. I can show you lots of mechanisms why broccoli causes cancer, or why things like I think it's celery or something. I mean, there's lots of studies that show certain vegetables mechanistically can cause cancer. So those are there. The problem is the epidemiology doesn't support it. So then your argument sort of revolves around epidemiology. And so the problem with epidemiology is, unless the risk that you demonstrate is something like 100%, and this is something called the Bradford Hill criteria, unless you can show that there's a doubling in the incidence of, whatever condition, red meat causes cancer 100% more than if you don't. And the problem is you never show that. You show, like the World Health Organization they demonstrated something, they said it was a 17% risk. So that's really kind of clinically meaningless. But more importantly, if we all know that correlation doesn't cause causation. I mean, I think most people in the nutrition space have heard this enough. And so if I say, Kevin Bacon movies are associated with drowning in the summer, and you're going to say, well, that's just stupid. Even though it's just a correlation, it doesn't.
I think they actually are, though.
Well, maybe they are, but I mean, but then we look at this and then we say, well, if that correlation is true, if we're going to impart causation on this, and remember when we looked at smoking and said smoking is causative in lung cancer, it wasn't a 17% increase. It was a 2,000% increase. It was a 3,000% increase. It was overwhelmingly, convincingly positive. That you can say that, so you can even start to do that. But so if we look at the other studies, like so in Western populations, and where most of this epidemiology is done, in the United States, in the UK, people that eat more meat show a slight increase in colorectal cancer based on epidemiology. But if you go to Asia, Asia's got 4.5 billion people, and you do the same studies on Asians, there's no relationship whatsoever to red meat and colorectal cancer. Because, and my assumption is because when Americans eat meat, most Americans that are meat eaters have been told meat is bad for you. And so if you're going to continue to eat meat, you're kind of an unhealthy person in the first place. You're going to go to McDonald's and get your burger with your French fries cooked in vegetable oil. You're going to drink the Coke. You're going to have the Frosty at Wendy's. You're going to eat your hot apple pie, which is, just vegetable oil and sugar and a bunch of other garbage. So this is the difference. So when we look at Asians, they don't get colorectal cancer, on any relationship with red meat or even processed meat. Doesn't matter if it's cooked, doesn't matter if it's raw. And so, what is it unique about Asian people? Are they genetically protected from getting colorectal cancer? And the answer is no, because when they move to the United States, guess what happens to their colorectal cancer incidence? It goes straight back up. So it's a Western diet in general. It's not the meat part of the diet. And so that's how, when I look at that, and again, let's just assume the epidemiology is right. And yes, there's a 17% increased risk of colorectal cancer from eating red meat. Okay. That means an absolute risk. It takes your lifetime risk from 4% to 5%. So it's a 1% increase in risk. So it's really small. It's like, okay, I'm 1% more likely to get colorectal cancer. Okay, I'm willing to take that chance because I really like eating steak. Okay. But even if we assume that risk is real, and it very likely isn't, then you have to say, well, what other things are out there that can cause colorectal cancer or can be associated with colorectal cancer? Because remember, it's not just one thing. It's not like the only reason people get colorectal cancer is because they eat meat.
Exactly.
Bigger things are visceral body fat. So if you've got a bunch of belly fat, you got a bunch of liver fat or pancreas fat hanging around, your risk is going to go up not 17%, but something like 300%. So then we're like, okay, well, what about hyperinsulinemia? If your insulin's out of control, guess what happens to your colorectal risk? It goes up another couple 100%. What happens if you have chronic inflammation? Guess what? Colorectal risk goes up. What happens if you have irritable bowel syndrome or Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis? The last two, the Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, your colorectal cancer risk may go up 2,000, 3,000%. So then we look at what happens to people who are eating meat-only diets to their visceral body fat. They typically get leaner. Their insulin typically gets better. Their inflammatory markers typically get better. And this is what I see over and over again. If they have Crohn's or ulcerative colitis or even IBS, those things all get better. So if those things are all getting better, guess what's happening to your colorectal cancer risk? It's dramatically dropping, even if you still believe that tiny 17% risk is still part of the equation. And so I think you got to look at the overall package with that. And so that's how I look at colorectal cancer risk. And I think we have to. The problem is we become very reductionist. You can't be reductionist about health. Health is so complicated. There's so many factors that go into that. And the same thing can be said for cardiovascular disease. Yes, a higher fat diet can be associated, and it's kind of funny because some people will see their cholesterol fall. Some people won't change at all. Some people will see an elevation in things like their LDL cholesterol. I didn't see much change at all in mine. Mine was about the same. It didn't change really much. The only thing that happened to me was my HDL got a little better and my triglycerides dropped really low, which is nice. But, when we sit there and look at overall risk for cardiovascular disease, it's the same sort of metric you put in there. Okay, what do we know about diabetic pathophysiology and insulin resistance? If that's a problem, your cardiovascular risk goes way up. What about your triglycerides? If that's a problem, your risk goes up. What about chronic inflammation? If that goes up, your risk goes up. And then you say, well, what about LDL? And then it's like, well, maybe that's a risk factor, but we got to take the whole package into consideration. And again, what I'm seeing is blood pressure normalizes, inflammation markers go down, triglycerides tend to plummet. All these things are occurring that are good cardiovascular. And again, same thing with body composition. If you're getting leaner, your cardiovascular risk is going down. And so you have to put this into the big picture perspective and not just worry about one little lab value, because it leads us down a kind of a bad path in my view.
Right. I think it's important too, as you said before, like how are you actually feeling? And to me, I'm an experimenter. If I'm not going to go based on some peer-reviewed research. I'm going to put it to the test in my own body, see how I feel, pay attention to my biomarkers. When I drastically up my cholesterol, I feel freaking amazing. My body operates, my mind operates, my workouts, everything is drastically, noticeably improved. And my digestion and skin tone is also noticeably improved too. And so for me, the proof is in the pudding. It's very obvious. I'm curious, how much of your meat, if any, are you eating raw? What's your kind of standpoint on that? Because there is some debate even within the carnivore community, like raw's law, and it kind of reminds me of the early Western days of the raw vegans fighting each other. It's like the carnivores were at each other's throats. What's your thoughts on raw or not?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see a problem with eating raw meat. I mean, for most people, I mean, there are, I mean, with the caveat that there potentially can be contamination issues. And so I think you have to be mindful of that. And in all honesty, humans ate a lot of raw meat growing up as humans. I mean, that's what we did before we developed fire. So we clearly were doing that. And culturally throughout the world, there are many, many cultures that still eat lots of raw meat. So I don't think there's, a necessarily reason to say you can't do it. And I've tried it and I've had it and I eat raw meat every once in a while. If I go to a restaurant and there's steak tartare on the menu or beef carpaccio, I won't hesitate to eat that. I've had sushi, obviously, most of us have had. We haven't blinked an eye. But for me, and I really tried to, go with, trying to eat it more frequently, and I just don't find it very appealing to me. Mm-hmm. And so whether or not there's benefits, and that is highly debatable in my mind, I think you have to do something that's palatable and something you're going to be able to sustain. And for me, sitting down to a hunk of raw meat for breakfast, it just doesn't get me out of bed, man. It just doesn't get me going. And so I'm not at any means opposed to people who want to do that. And I've interviewed several of people who do that. I'm all more power to you. But at the same time, I mean, looking at the results that people are getting, and that's what I'm really interested is in actual human results and seeing what people are doing and what the results they're getting. I'm seeing plenty of people getting excellent results, recovering from all kinds of diseases, eating cooked meat. And, and this also dovetails in the conversation about grass-fed versus, grain fish. I'm seeing the same results in those people. And so I try to be as honest as I can with people and say, look, this is the results people are getting. Yes, there may be an ethical reason to eat grass finished. Yes, personally, you may feel better on grass finished, or you might feel better on grain finished. I don't know. But I don't think we can sit there as a community and say, this is the law. This is the way you've got to do it. I know there's like a nose to tail sort of thing. And I'm good friends with the people that are doing this, and I'm fully supportive of them getting out there and spreading the message. But at the same time, I'm sitting back kind of, and I, by no means am I the longest guy that's been doing this, but I've been doing it for a couple of years now. And I just sit back and say, I'm going to wait. I'm going to hold my sort of vote until the results are in. I don't think the results are in yet. And so I think we just have to, at this point, say there are a lot of options. Pick one that suits you and see how you do.
Awesome. But by no means, in your opinion and experience, does cooking meat and doing that in a healthy way diminish the nutritional value, its ability to digest and assimilate well. It's not like the raw is going to be head and shoulders better for healing.
Well, I mean, that's not been the collective experience of this community that I've been very meticulous at in following. And so, some people say, well, certain proteins are denatured, certain things by heat, but at the same time, what's the first thing that happens when the food hits your stomach? I mean, it's poured into a huge vat of gastric, hydrochloric acid of pH 1.5. And so that too is a destructive process for a lot of these chemicals or these,
exactly.
Nutrients. And so, whether heating, breaks down some of this stuff a little bit for us, there's evidence that it might free up some more calories for us. That's one of the thoughts on cooking, and maybe it has more impact on vegetables in particular because, trying to go out there and try to eat a raw potato, see how you fare, versus a cooked one. And it's night and day difference. And so even if there's a difference that, we can, and there are some studies that would support there is a little bit of a difference. I don't think it's enough of a difference that it would say, oh my gosh, if you don't eat it this way, you're going to get some nutritional deficiency. It just doesn't happen clinically. And again, it's, at some point you've got to realize that even though, I mean, we like to pretend we can go back to caveman times and live in the wild and eat like wild people did, you still live in the modern world, and you still got, you still got to, maybe you don't have to, but I mean, if you want to live in a social society, you still have to be able to go to a restaurant and order a steak and, and just say, cook it rare for me or whatever, sear the edges and stuff like that. And that's fine. I don't think there's a, you know, I just think that works a little better for most people. Now, some people are, some people just content to stay home and eat all their food, and maybe they'll go to the restaurant and they'll say, hey, don't cook the steak. And they're willing to put up with the 50 questions that come after that inevitably.
Right. That's great. So just for my eczema people out there, if you're finding yourself in a rhythm, cooking your steaks, cooking your meat, and you're enjoying it, it's working for you, stay there. You're good. Don't trip out. I want to talk to you a little bit about digestion. So one of the things that happened to me when I transitioned was I went from, plant-based poop world, poop king, 25 times a day, just nonstop, to doing these little rabbit pellets once a day and feeling like there's nothing in my stomach. I go from plants making me feel bloated and full constantly to meat. I eat it, nothing happens. I poop little pellets. Everyone's tripping out and saying, where's all the poop? Please explain to people what is going on so people can understand a little bit deeper of what's really happening with the assimilation and digestion process.
Yeah. So, human beings, and it's clear again, assuming you believe in a theory of evolution, many people, and there's people out there that don't, but I mean, if we assume that humans evolved from a common primate ancestor to things like chimps and gorillas, and we diverged 7 to 10 million years ago, depending on which anthropology record you read, and then during that process, particularly starting in about 3 or 4 million years ago, we started to eat more meat, and so our anatomy started to change. We sort of went away from a large hindgut, which a lot of these gorillas and chimps have. They have a fairly significant hindgut fermentation capacity. So that means they can take fiber and plant material in their colon, which is much, much bigger in the chimpanzee or the gorilla, and they have a pretty good capacity to turn that material into short chain fatty acids. So they're even though they're eating a high fiber plant-based diet, they're still absorbing a high fat diet. So, but it's coming from short chain fatty acids, things like butyrate and other fermentation products, propionate and things like that. So as we lost some of that capacity, as our colon shrank, we lost some of that fermentative capacity. And so now if we do comparative anatomy between other animals, our fermentative capacity based on the amount of GI tract we have is about 17%, which is about the same as a dog or a cat. Dogs and cats have about 15, 16, 17, 18% fermentation capacity when we talk about the total amount of, intestinal tract, digestive tract we have. So we've lost some of that capacity. And so we became a very acid dependent, this strong, powerful hydrochloric acid we have in our stomach. Remember, our hydrochloric acid tends to be about 1.5. Sometimes I've seen studies down as low as 1.1. That's on par with scavenger animals like hyenas, vultures, and other animals that probably started out scavenging, which most likely humans did as well. We probably started out scavenging until we learned how to hunt. So we've got this tremendously acid stomach, and we've got this incredibly relatively long small intestine relative to other primates. And so that is perfectly designed to absorb protein and fat. And that's, generally from what we get from meat. But when we look at ileostomy patients, so there are patients out there that have lost their colon for various reasons, whether it's from colon cancer or they've had Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, and they had to lose their colon. And so now they just have a little bag, a little pouch. So we can see what comes out the small intestine. And there's studies that have looked at that, and there's plenty of ileostomy patients that'll confirm that. I've talked to many of them. They'll say, when I eat meat, the only thing that comes out of my out of my stoma into my bag is just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit amount, a little bit of liquid. When I eat fiber, nothing gets digested. It all goes in my colon. So it has to be digested by bacteria in my colon. And that's where you get the bloating. That's where you get the gas. And, you think about, and I think this is an interesting point. Think about breathing. Does it hurt you to breathe? And you'd say no. And if it did, if it hurt you, you'd say, wait, there's something wrong. I need to go see the doctor. When your heart beats, does it hurt you for your heart to beat? And you say, no, it doesn't hurt. And when you walk around, do your joints hurt? And most people, the answer should be no. If not, there's something wrong. But we accept the fact that our digestion can hurt. We're like, well, bloating, it's just bloating, it's just gas, it's just normal. I would posit that humans are not designed to hurt. I mean, a normally functioning system should not hurt us. And so, we shouldn't accept bloating and gas and discomfort as normal. That means there's something wrong going on. And I would argue it's a diet. And so, but to your point about, large bowel movements versus small bowel movements, I mean, it's as simple as the fact as you are now absorbing all of that nutrition. It's not going to waste. You're not flushing it down the toilet. So all that organic fruit you spent at Whole Foods and you spent high dollar for, you ate, half of it ended up in the toilet. 40% of it ended up in the landfill, and then half of it ended up in the toilet. And so you're being very wasteful. You're not taking in the calories. That's why a lot of vegans can lose weight, because a lot of their nutrition just ends up in the toilet. On a meat-based diet, it's extremely different. All of that food, almost all of it, ends up where it's supposed to go, which is to your tissues. It gets in your bloodstream, and then you get the amino acids and the fats and the fat-soluble vitamins and minerals. All of that gets into where it needs to go. And therefore, you just don't have as much waste. And so now the waste products are what it's supposed to be. It's, some bacteria, and it's a little bit of the sloughed off, cells lining our digestive tract. And that's what the stool becomes. And so it's a lot smaller. And so people, when they initially transition to diet, they're like, oh my God, I didn't have a bowel movement today. Some people, it might take them 3, 4, 5 days, even a week before they have their first bowel movement, because their body is just like, I'm not wasting anything anymore. And so nothing really is built up. And so it takes, several days. And, there's some people that have transition issues. There's some people have diarrhea. Some people have some people have some constipation, but in general, it's just, you're not wasting food like you used to, it's not, again, you're eating a high quality nutrition that your body needs and is utilizing as much as it can.
Awesome. And a lot of people too, the one concern, and I'm curious I always ask this question to my carnivore friends, is where do you source your meat? Do you have a farm? Do you do it online? Do you just go to Whole Foods? What's your kind of rhythm with that?
So it's interesting. So I get a lot of meats, as you might be, wonder, as I become kind of a meat advocate, there's a lot of ranchers just send me their meat, which is great. I mean, I get free meat, and I'm fully happy to admit that, and if you want to send me free meat, I'm happy to eat it. So I get a lot of this, and it's really high end, nice, sustainably raised stuff. I mean, I get some stuff online, places like Butcher Box and some of these other places. Sometimes I go to the store. I mean, I just, I'm not, I'm practical about it. There is meat is not cheap. I mean, particularly if you're eating steaks, which I like to do. So you got to sometimes make a financial decision there. And, if I got to a point where I had unlimited resources and cash, then I would probably say, well, I'd like to buy from this particular farmer or whatever. I really like his quality or his meat or something like that. But that's not the reality for most people. And I want to represent what most people have access to, because most people don't have access to unlimited money where they can say, I'm only going to buy meat that was raised by Buddhist monks, and watered with their tears. And, I mean, I just don't think that's necessarily correct. Now, do I think we should try to, as a community, continue to encourage sustainable practices? Absolutely, I do. But I think at the same time, we still have to consider human health. And if all you can afford is cheap ground beef from Walmart, and that's all your budget allows you, do that, because you're still going to be healthier than if you decided, well, I can't afford it. So I can't afford the best. So now I'm just going to eat potato chips and crackers and processed food, which many people do. And, like I said, if you can afford organic fruits and vegetables, you can afford meat. If you can't afford organic and fruits and vegetables, you might be able to afford cheap ground beef, or you can afford the potato chips. And then you have to make a decision what you're going to do. And so I think from an ethics standpoint, and again, I made this point, and a lot of vegans don't like this, but I mean, if you say, as an ethical vegan, my goal is to do the least harm to animals, then you have to say eating a 100% grass-finished animal is the most ethical thing you can do, based on the fact that you're only killing one animal. And even though you say, well, it's not my intention that these field mice and rabbits and bugs and all these other things die because they spray pesticides and farmers shoot them to get them out of their crops, that's not my intention. Well, the animals don't care what your intention is. They're either dead or they're not. And so, I mean, would you rather have an animal that's been run over by a grain thresher, that's been maimed and bleeding to death in the field and lays there for 2 days dying? Or would you rather have a cow that's, had a nice life on grass, and then taken and then killed within a millisecond? I mean, what is more ethical and sustainable in my view? And I think it's clear. And while they'll say most people don't do that, most people don't eat grass fed, but you can make that individual choice. If it's all about ethics to you, you can certainly, make the choice to do that. And so that's where I think the ethical argument falls short for many of the vegans.
Yeah, that's great advice. I also hear I don't want to really make any of my stuff about anti-vegan stuff. I don't think that's your cause either, but I think some of it's good to note. One thing that I do get often in the comment sections or emails is, your vegan diet wasn't deficient. You just did it wrong. You didn't get malnourishment. Your teeth didn't fall out. You didn't become emaciated because of the diet. You did it wrong. And they say that there's certain nutrients that you can get from meat. The meat eaters say that there's nutrients you can get. The vegans say that there's not. What is your opinion on that?
Well, I think, this whole "you did it wrong," I think there are, so, I mean, I think humans are all the same species. I mean, I think we all clearly have a common diet that we can generally eat. In my view, it's, a meat-based diet works. But I think when we get into a plant-based diet where we're now trying to cobble together, a balanced diet, and we got to get a little of this and a little of that. We got to get Dr. Grieger's daily dozen so we don't screw up, and we got to take supplements. But then there are people that have certain genetic, like SNPs or single nucleotide polymorphisms or different things where they can't make certain conversions. Vitamin A is one that very people like to talk about. How well can you effectively convert beta carotene to retinol? And if you don't have a very good capacity to do that, then it may be more difficult for you to be successful on a vegan diet. There's, same thing with EPA and DHA. How there's conversions have to be, and how well do you convert the omega-3s from flaxseed oil, and so there's people that have different tolerances. So it may not be that you didn't do it right. It's just maybe you're just not designed to do well on a vegan diet. And it's as simple as that. And how many of those people are like that? Well, if we look at the attrition rates, again, there's a study that came out, and it was it wasn't a great study. I mean, people quote that, and it says 84% of the people fail. I don't know how many people fail a vegan diet. I suspect quite a few. I'd say probably the majority of people that try it eventually leave it within most quit it within a few months. Many people make it several years. Many people just stop it. Then there's certainly, and we can all point to people that have been thriving for decades on that, right? And it may be just they're just so, whether you want to say lucky or not, or just genetically made that they can handle the diet. And so I don't think it's, the people that I've talked to that have done a vegan diet and failed on it, most of them have tried to do it the right way. They've done it the Dr. Grieger way. They've done it the Dr. Garth Davis way. They've done it the Dr. Joel Kahn way. They've tried the McDougall way. They've tried the, whatever. And people all say, well, that way is the wrong way, or this way is the wrong way. And then some of them go crazy and they do the fast and the fruit, the fruitarian stuff. And you see that just becomes a precipitous spiral downward as they're desperately trying to make their diet match their ethics because they're feeling so bad, and you
100%.
Fall out. And so and then people says, well, you went fruitarian. Well, it's because they were feeling so bad on the whole food plant-based diet. I don't think anybody goes into a vegan diet with the starting point is, I'm going to do juice fast and drink my own urine and fast all the time. I don't think most people, 16-year-old kids are going, hey, I'm going to go vegan and drink urine and go on a fruit fast. I don't think that's how they start. I think most of them are starting out, eating a diet that's recommended, and then it goes sideways on them. That's my take from 50,000 feet above, looking at the whole process.
I agree. I think too, it's a process of, when people when their belief system gets threatened, they're gonna lash out. I know from my experience, it's 100% based on the evidence that's hitting me in the face. On the vegan diet, I focused completely on eating all whole foods. I did do a heavily cleansing diet and detoxification. I was on it for 8 years. And for a lot of those years, it was good compared to my standard American diet. Then I got to a literal place where my body was falling apart. I was in pain. I was hurting. And the switching over and the transitioning of the diet to where it is now, a pure carnivore diet, the difference is night and day. The issues I was having as a vegan are 100% gone. 20 pounds heavier, slightly less body fat, digestion's back on point, teeth have regenerated. It just speaks for itself. I'm curious from your standpoint, because my channel is so focused on helping people with eczema, immune disorders, and digestion, would you slant or switch up the carnivore diet, or what would be your kind of tips and tricks for people with immune stuff who are going to do the carnivore diet as a healing mechanism?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a definite relationship between gut health and various autoimmune conditions, including skin conditions like psoriasis, eczema, and a whole host of other things. And so I think that we have to figure out why we're having a compromised gut integrity. And we, a lot of people have talked about the term leaky gut syndrome, where the lining of the gut is composed of all these cells that are held together by gap junctions. And so what happens is certain foods and medications can disrupt those gap junctions. So now you have things that kind of leak past that barrier, and they get into the body where they're not supposed to be there. And it might be some kind of bacterial lipopolysaccharide or some other, some other foreign compounds, and that sets up a chronic inflammatory or immune type condition, and then it shows up in rashes, and even it can be mental health problems. It can be a lot of things, joint pain, a whole bunch of different things. We see that. And so I think, having a focus on the gut is very important. And so when we look at, foods that tend to do that, and this is based on some of the research coming out of Hungary from the Paleomedicina group, who's looked at this specifically in a carnivore community. They saw that medications in particular, and even some supplements, can be very disruptive to the gut barrier. Seed oils particularly. So if you're cooking your meat in olive oil, even, that may potentially be problematic. Olive oil is technically a fruit oil, but so I think you just, and then there's all kinds, lectins and oxalates and nightshades and other foods that grains, sweeteners and sugars, those things can be problematic. And so if you're really dealing with a disease process and you really want to, eliminate all the potential things, then I think you just have to be fairly strict about it. I mean, I think you have to not indulge in artificial sweeteners, maybe give up coffee, certainly give up maybe alcohol. You have to, get rid of any kind of, some of the seasonings. You might just have to be bland, and maybe it's salt, some sort of meat, and water to drink. And, and I think there's some evidence. Some people think that maybe keeping your fat macro ratio is a little bit higher. There's a called Paleolithic ketogenic diet, where they like to keep fat macronutrient ratios at about 2 to 1. So you're eating about an 80% by calorie. It's a very ketogenic style diet, and so that might be a baseline for people to look at, but then again, you've got to give it enough time to adapt. You've got to be objective about it. The other thing that's important to realize, and I've learned this, not too long ago, is depending on what your previous diet was, things like oxalates in the diet. So if you were on a ketogenic diet, or even a vegan diet where you're eating a lot of leafy greens and vegetables, and you're getting a lot of oxalates, well, those things tend to take residence in our tissues in the body, and they can kind of leach out over a period of time. And so and sometimes they do it in sort of large doses, and so it becomes an oxalate dumping type phenomenon. So it may be that, as you transition into the diet, if you're eating a heavily plant-based or ketogenic diet where those foods are very prominent, you might have to taper off of those things. And I think that's just something to be aware of, that you can flare up a problem with things like oxalate dumping as it goes from the tissue to the serum and then gets redistributed to other tissues. So that may be, may confuse things a little bit. So you might start out in the diet and your psoriasis gets better, and then all of a sudden it flares up. It might have been this problem where you've had, hyperoxaluria or hyperoxalemia, where you've got too much oxalate floating around your system just because it's leaching out of, wherever it's been for 20 years or 10 years or something like that. And so, but I do think being very strict is probably ultimately what you need to do for a while, and that's tough to do. Some people transitioning straight to, you're telling me I got to go from eating 100 different types of food to eating, beef, salt, and water. That's a tough one for a lot of people. And so it just may be that you realize that you're going to need, maybe you can start with a little bit more variety early on. Maybe you can do a little bit of, and dairy can be problematic for a lot of people, particularly with autoimmune disease and skin issues. So I don't want to minimize the point that dairy can be a problem. So, but for some people, variety works, and they can do eggs, and they can do different cuts of meat, and they may have a little bit of dairy and cheese, and they may have to cook with a little butter, and they have a little more spices, just to make the diet more easy to transition to from a palatability standpoint and a variety standpoint, and more of a mostly a psychological standpoint. But then realize that if my psoriasis is still a problem, then I got to get tighter. I got to dial it in more, and I might have to drop the eggs. I might have to drop the dairy. I might have to, drop all these crazy seasonings and go to salt, and then play with the fat ratios.
Awesome. So it's the good old fashioned stuff we teach on this channel constantly. It's simplify the diet, see what's going to digest and be the easiest for you. And don't give up. You got to stay consistent over the long term. Let the body do its thing. Be patient with the transition. So awesome. I think that's fantastic advice. I just wanted to mention we're at the hour mark. I don't know how you're doing with time.
Yeah, I can go for a little bit longer. Yeah, I was just going to say, because I've done a lot of just inquiries on people that have done, and I think, we can learn a lot from patients. I mean, it's very important to talk to people and see what the results are. And with things with psoriasis, I saw that about 50% of the people within a month got a pretty good response on psoriasis, but there's 50% of the people where, it took 3 months or more. And so I think you just have to realize that sometimes these things are, they respond quickly, and sometimes they don't. And, like I said, I think at some point you got to say, you just got to throw in the towel and say, hey, it ain't for me. But I think, just realize that may be 3 months or more before you've really given it an adequate trial. I mean, if it doesn't work for you in a week, I mean,
right.
That's probably not a good enough period of time. But at the same point, I don't think you should spend, 3 or 4 years, to kind of parody some of the vegans of detoxing. I mean, I think that's silly. I mean, if it doesn't work after a decent trial of several months, then look somewhere else.
Yeah. Also, I think there's 2 good points in there. Many people with the skin disease issues and autoimmune disease issues, they over focus on the symptom to tell them if they're healing or not, rather than looking at all of the other biomarkers in the body. What is the body telling you? Are you sleeping well? Are you getting morning woods? How's your energy? How's your focus? How's your hunger? How's your digestion? Does it hurt? Does it feel good? If those things are all improving every month, but your skin might not be showing many signs, then hey, you're probably on the right track and you need a little bit more time. Or vice versa. If those biomarkers are going nuts, then you got to make the adjustment.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. A lot of people will come on a diet, and I see this all the time. They'll come on for one specific reason, and a lot of it's weight loss. A lot of women will come on the diet trying to lose that last 20 pounds, and they've been dieting their whole life, and they may have lost 50 pounds on a ketogenic diet. But they'll get on a carnivore diet, and they're like, man, I didn't lose any weight or even gain 5 pounds. I'm like, why are you still doing it? And they'll say, because I feel so great. Everything else has gotten better in my life. And so I think we do have to realize that just because you've got psoriasis or eczema or, dyshydrotic, all the skin conditions you can potentially have, just because you have that and that's not responding right away does not mean there aren't other things that your diet can help. And a lot of people will say, yeah, my skin's still not completely clear, but I mean, my mood is so much better. My energy is so much better. My sex life is better. My strength is better. So you have to realize that some of these diseases take a long time to sort of manifest themselves, and it may take a long time to fix them as well. And so, I mean, again, if you're going in the right direction, but conversely, if you said, if everything's going wrong, and I don't see that very often, quite honestly, but if everything's going wrong, then you have to say, yeah, definitely, let's make an adjustment. It may be carnivore diet's not right for you, or maybe some aspect of it's not right for you, but then you have to start to adjust. But if so many things are going good, then you just kind of have to say, well, maybe this little aspect's going to take a little longer.
Yeah, that's awesome. How about for just general health maintenance for people on a carnivore diet? Do you suggest anything special? Arterial scans? Is there anything that a carnivore eater should just pay extra attention to?
Well, I think if we want to get into, looking at metrics of health, and I think there's different ways to do this, and I am as much as I've been criticized about this, I still think it's incredibly important. I think we do have to do some subjective assessment. And I think, again, how do I feel? How do I look? What's my digestion like? What's my sex? My libido like? What's my joint pain like? All the things that may, it depends how old you are. Young people don't have many issues, so it's not but when you get a little older, when you get in your 40s and 50s, there's things that creep up. You're like, okay, I can assess that. I can tell if I'm healthy or not.
40 next year.
Yeah, so those things are important to keep an eye on. And then then when you start getting into the medical world, inevitably they're going to say, well, you need this test or that test. And so I think it's important to realize what these tests can tell us, realize that they may not be exactly accurate in a population that doesn't eat carbohydrates. And so we have to realize that the reference ranges may be different. But we come to things like, well, we're going to look at, our cholesterol. Well, I mean, fine if you want to look at that, but then you should really dig down and understand other things. So if your doctor says, I want to run a lipid panel on you, then you might say, well, let's get an advanced lipid panel so I can look at all these other aspects of it, and I can see more details to see how potentially problematic this is or is not. If I want to look at your hemoglobin A1C or your glucose, why don't we get an insulin level too to see what's going on with my insulin? Because you can have a completely normal glucose and have sky high insulin, and you're basically becoming diabetic at that point, but your doctor won't know it. And so I think you have to be smarter than your doctor sometimes, and you have to, and not to say that doctors aren't smart. I mean, many of them are, or most of them are, quite honestly, but they just don't know. I mean, they're smart, but maybe ignorant. And so you have to kind of be your own best advocate. And I think for me, long-term measures of health are more important than often a lab, because a lab, you remember, your blood tests can change every single day. You could get the same blood test 5 days in a row and get 5 different readings. And sometimes they're very variable depending on what the test is and what the time of the day is. Like for instance, if you get a vitamin D level checked in the morning, it might be low, but if you checked it 4 or 5 hours later, it would be normal. And so we have to be cognizant of the fact that these diurnal variations occur. And that's why I like things like, if you're old enough, 20 years old, you don't need a coronary artery calcium scan. You just don't need to do that. It's silly. If you're in your 40s and 50s and you want to look at heart health, at least maybe you should get that. Maybe you should look at that as a baseline reference number. Waist to height ratio is a tremendously important tool. I mean, it's simple. You take a tape measure, you measure around your belly, see what it is. If your waist is 36 inches and you're taller than 72 inches, you're good to go. You want to keep that number under 50%. And ideally, I think the ideal number, some people say about 46, 47%. So you want your waist circumference to be 47% of your height. That's considered a decent waist to height measure. And that is a very good proxy measure for all kinds of things that, you don't need a doctor to assess you on that. So I think we have to look at these things that are, because you can walk into the doctor's office and be just way overweight and obese and just horrible condition, and you can pull perfectly good lab values. You can have perfectly fine cholesterol and beautiful blood sugar, and still be a physical wreck. And so again, you have to put the whole thing into perspective.
Yeah, I tend to work with a population that's skin disease, and in my opinion, like a lot of other aspects of health, it's a very lost. The doctors are lost. They're coming from a place of first of the belief that it cannot be changed or cured or benefit by diet in any way. I think that you can't help a person if you have that type of belief going into it. But secondly, the desire to test every single thing, and then from all those tests, like inflammatory markers, bowel stuff, the full blood panel, what does that even show? And does it even really need to happen? All of that testing. And I tell people, generally start with the basics, the holistic basics, do that for a while and see where you're at.
Yeah, I mean, inflammatory markers, C-reactive protein, tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin 6. I mean, then there's all these specific ones, disease-specific markers you can have, and gut function markers. Those things, well, you would expect someone with a disease process to have some of those markers being positive. It would indicate, yes, the gut's inflamed or irritated or leaky, and yes, there's some inflammatory markers going around, and yes, you have this disease. We already know that when you walked in the door. I mean, they may be able to put a better name on it or something like that. And then they may tailor it. They may say, well, here, we can give you this cream you can put on your skin, or we can give you this disease modifying drug you can take as a pill. It's very expensive and can cause all kinds of side effects. And you might put you at more risk for cancer and infectious diseases and so on and so forth, and suppresses your immune system, and treat it from the outside, or just try to shotgun it and kill the whole entire immune system, which is, or you could say, why don't we figure out why I have this? Human beings aren't supposed to have eczema. Human beings aren't supposed to have psoriasis. It's not a normal human state. It's not a genetic thing. It's not bad luck. It's something that's happening in your environment. Fix the environment, and most often that environmental issue is food. And so I think that's really where you got to come to. And yeah, I mean, those markers can be used to assess improvement, but again, you got to remember inflammatory markers are, psoriasis is not the only thing that's going to raise an inflammatory marker. Exercise might do that. A poor night of sleep might do that. A cold might do that. So you have to kind of realize that these things are very dynamic and responsive to a lot of things that are not super specific. They're just general markers of inflammation in most cases. And so it's kind of like, if it's low and zero, hey, that's good. That's a good sign. But if it's high, it might be high for XYZ, 1, 2, 3 different reasons. And so we have to kind of be mindful of that.
That's awesome. I have a personal question. I always ask this of people. It kind of inspires me. For you, you wake up in the morning. What does a perfect day look like for you? If you had to hand choose your day, you can do whatever you want with the people you want. What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be a lot of playing. I mean, I wouldn't be doing podcasts. I wouldn't be posting on Instagram, or I wouldn't have my phone with me. I'd be out, I might get up in the morning, get out to the beach, with the family, walk, watch the sunset come, or sunrise, start the day with that, and just, just see what it takes me, and hang out and chill out and, have some good food and just have some fun, get out in the sun. And I think that's what human beings did. You think about what our lives are these days, and it's a rat race. We're stuck in cubicles. And I mean, human beings evolved, our job was to go get some food and then hang out. I mean, that was, and, maybe defend ourselves if we had to, but I mean, generally it was just probably a lot of, just interaction with your local people and, community, and just hanging out and enjoying yourselves and enjoying your time and being thankful for, just the experience you have.
Awesome. Well, that sounds like a wonderful philosophy. It's something that my listeners hear me preaching all the time. If you're going to heal, you got to be happy. And if you're going to have a good life, you got to be doing things in the hours of the day that you want to be doing. That's really awesome. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show. I think you dropped a lot of great tidbits for my listeners. In closing, your website, meatheals.com, is that correct?
Yeah, I've got meatheals.com. That's just, that's just people submitting their stories, telling us what happened when they went on a meat-based diet. So I think we're a couple hundred of them in now. And so people are, every day people submit a story, and we just put it up there. When Michael, Mike Goldstein is the guy that helps me with that. And when he gets a moment, he'll post them up there. So we keep encouraging people to share the story. I just think it's, one of the ways the message gets out there is people respond to, they sort of identify with people that are in similar conditions. And so it's nice to be able to see, somebody that's done it ahead of you, and you can say, hey, I've got psoriasis, or I've got, anxiety, or I've got, ankylosing spondylitis, and hey, look, this guy did that. And so while it's not pure science, but it's still, there is some value in that. And I think people that totally dismiss anecdote are missing the boat, because that's how a lot of science starts. It's observation, it's hypothesis generating, but more importantly, it's inspiring, because, I'm not going to sit there. If I've got a disease that's ruining my quality of life, I'm not going to sit there and wait for 30 years for them to keep publishing studies before I decide what I'm going to do. And so if I see somebody else has done it and it's not blatantly harmful, then why not try it? And I think this is what we're seeing with that. And so that's, something that I started a little over a year ago, and I think it's been very beneficial to a lot of people. And I think it's helped a lot of people at least be willing to be open-minded enough to try this. And that's great. And so I've got that. I've got Shawn-Baker.com. So it's SHAWN-BAKER.com. I got a book coming out, Carnivore Diet, up for pre-order. It'll be available in, I think, August. And then, a few of the World Carnivore Tribe is a group where we got a lot of people doing a carnivore diet. I started there's a group for ex-vegans called the Restoration Health Vegan Recovery Group. We got close to 2,000 members of ex-vegans in there, just kind of sharing their story and supporting each other. It's a supportive environment for people that are coming from vegan vegan background, they want to just get healthier, and they want to be a place where they can talk to each other and kind of commiserate on how they solve certain problems and the issues they had, and that's been helpful. And we're starting animal-based-nutrition-network.com, which is going to be, I'm really excited about that, because we're going to be bringing together healthcare providers that are supportive of people doing, maybe not strict carnivore diet, but diets that celebrate having animal nutrition. And some of the ranchers, like people that want to get the sustainably raised stuff, we're going to bring a lot of those guys in the fold, and teaching people about the environment, some of the ethical stuff, some of the, how to do it healthily, recipes, that sort of stuff. So we're bringing that all together coming very soon. So that's going to be up in the near future as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show today. And thanks so much for everything that you're doing, putting out your truth, telling your story. I definitely advise everyone, go to meatheals.com and all the other resources. Community is so important when you're healing. There's so many different levels. And I'm just like Dr. Shawn Baker, and I'm a fan of anecdotal evidence. I base my whole life on it, to be honest with you. I love science. I love research. But at the end of the day, if you're sick, you got to do what you got to do to feel good. And learning from other humans and being positively influenced by what they're actually doing with their actions in their day-to-day is super important.
Yeah, you can't, science is not just the purview of scientists. You can do your own science. And that's, there's no law that says you can't make observations and adjust. And so I think it's in your best interest to figure out what works for you and not depend on somebody else to take care of your health, because no one cares about it as much as you, say maybe perhaps your mom or something like that. But
Awesome.